Olivia Hayes had no idea that booking a first-class ticket would turn into a battle at 35,000 feet. She had paid for her seat, confirmed her reservation, yet when she stepped onto the plane, her seat had mysteriously been given away. What started as a simple seating dispute soon unraveled into something much bigger, a hidden system, a deliberate scheme, and a truth the airline never expected to be exposed. They tried to silence her. They tried to make her back down. But Olivia Hayes wasn't about to let that happen. What she uncovered on this flight would shake an entire industry, and by the time the plane landed, nothing would ever be the same. Before we dive in, let us know, where in the world are you watching from? And if you love gripping, high-stakes stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be told. After an exhausting week of high-stakes business negotiations in Chicago, Olivia stepped onto the plane with a sigh of relief. She was finally heading home to Seattle and had splurged on a first-class ticket, seat 3A by the window, a well-earned moment of comfort after days of back-to-back meetings. As her heels clicked against the polished floor, she walked down the aisle, scanning the row numbers. 1A, 2A, there it was, 3A. But something was off. A man, mid-40s, clad in an expensive suit, casually flipping through a newspaper, was already sitting in her seat. Olivia frowned. She double-checked her boarding pass. Seat 3A. No mistake. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice polite. "I believe this is my seat." The man barely glanced up. "I don't think so." A flicker of irritation flared in Olivia's chest. Keeping her composure, she turned to a nearby flight attendant, a woman with a well-practiced smile and a name tag that read Emily Parker. "There seems to be a mistake," Olivia explained, handing over her ticket. "This is my seat." Emily's professional smile wavered slightly. She took the ticket, checked the system, and hesitated before meeting Olivia's gaze. "I'm so sorry, Miss Hayes, but there's been a reassignment. Your seat was changed." Olivia's brows furrowed. "Changed? By whom?" she pressed. Emily hesitated. The system automatically adjusted seating. Olivia inhaled deeply, keeping her voice steady. "And where exactly is my new seat?" Emily cleared her throat. "In economy." A stunned silence stretched between them. "Excuse me?" Olivia's tone sharpened. "I paid for first class." "I understand," Emily said quickly, her voice apologetic, "but there was an error." Olivia's patience was wearing thin. An error that just happens to downgrade only me? Around them, passengers had started to take notice. A woman in 2B whispered something to her husband. A man in 4A glanced up from his laptop, brows raised in curiosity. The tension in the cabin thickened. "I'd like to speak to the flight manager," Olivia said, crossing her arms. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Let me get him." As Emily hurried off, Olivia turned back to the man in 3A. He was still reading his newspaper, entirely unbothered. "You didn't book this seat, did you?" Olivia asked. He shrugged. "They told me I could sit here." Olivia clenched her jaw. Something was definitely wrong. A moment later, a tall man in a navy suit approached, the flight manager, Mark Sullivan. His forced smile and stiff body language told Olivia everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "Miss Hayes, I understand there's a concern," he said smoothly. "There's more than a concern," Olivia shot back. "I paid for seat 3A, but now I'm being told I was moved without my consent to economy." Mark glanced at Emily, then back at Olivia. "We had a last-minute request from a VIP. The system made the change." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "A VIP? Who?" Mark hesitated. I can't disclose that information." A slow realization dawned on Olivia. The man in her seat wasn't a VIP at all. He had simply asked for a better seat, and they gave him hers. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. More passengers were openly watching now. "This isn't about a system error, is it?" Olivia's voice was calm but razor-sharp. "This is about something else." Mark swallowed hard. "Miss Hayes, if you could just take your new seat." "No." Olivia stood her ground. "Either I get my seat back, or I need to make a call." Emily paled. "A call to who?" Olivia's lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "The airline's corporate office." The reaction was immediate. Mark stiffened. Emily took a step back. Even the man in 3A finally lowered his newspaper, looking mildly uncomfortable for the first time since Olivia boarded. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Mark cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control. Miss Hayes, I assure you, this was not intentional. Sometimes the system. Olivia held up a hand. Let's not waste time pretending that a system randomly moved only me. Let's be honest, Mark. Who made this decision? Emily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to Mark, as if seeking silent guidance. Mark's smile tightened, and for a brief moment, Olivia thought he might double down. But then, "Ma'am?" A new voice entered the conversation, a deep, authoritative tone. Olivia turned to see the captain standing at the entrance to the first-class cabin. His presence commanded attention. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, stepped forward. His hardened expression spoke of years in aviation, and the silver wings on his chest gleamed under the cabin lights. His sharp gaze swept across Olivia and then landed on Mark Sullivan, the flight manager. "What seems to be the issue here?" Captain Reynolds asked, his voice even but commanding. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Captain Reynolds, I was handling it. There was." "I'd like to hear it from her," the captain interrupted, turning his full attention to Olivia. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I booked seat 3A, paid for it weeks ago. When I boarded, I found someone else sitting there. I was told there was a system error. Now I'm being told I have to sit in economy instead." Captain Reynolds' brow furrowed. He turned to Mark. "A system error?" Mark cleared his throat. "There was a last-minute VIP request, so the system automatically." The captain raised a hand, cutting him off. "Who's the VIP?" A long pause. Mark hesitated, then his gaze flickered toward the man in 3A. Olivia didn't miss it. Neither did Captain Reynolds. The captain turned to the seated man. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" The man, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, suddenly looked uneasy. Slowly he set down his newspaper as if debating his next move. I don't have a printed one," he admitted. "They just told me to sit here." Captain Reynolds exhaled sharply. The man shifted in his seat. "The gate agent said I could get an upgrade if there was availability. I didn't know it would cause an issue." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Olivia could feel the shift in energy. The passengers were connecting the dots. Captain Reynolds turned back to Mark, his expression unreadable. "So, a last-minute request from a non-VIP overruled a confirmed paid first-class ticket?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no justifiable response. Then a quiet voice spoke up. "Captain, this isn't the first time something like this has happened." It was Emily Parker, the flight attendant. Mark's head snapped toward her, eyes wide in warning, but Emily didn't stop. "We've had similar cases before," she continued, her voice firm but quiet. "Usually with passengers like Miss Hayes." A tight knot formed in Olivia's stomach. She knew exactly what Emily meant, even if she didn't say it outright. Captain Reynolds let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. Then he turned back to Olivia. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice steady, "your seat is yours. Would you like me to personally ensure you're seated comfortably?" A beat of silence. Then, Olivia allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "I'd appreciate that." Captain Reynolds turned to Mark. "Make it right." Mark looked humiliated but nodded. "Of course, Captain." Without another word, the man in 3A stood, collecting his belongings. He didn't meet Olivia's eyes as he walked past her. As she settled into her rightful seat, she could feel the shift in the cabin. Passengers whispered, some nodded in approval. A few looked embarrassed, as if realizing they had stayed silent for too long. Emily bent down slightly, whispering, "I'm sorry, I really am." Olivia studied her face. There was genuine sincerity there. She nodded. "Thank you for speaking up." Emily straightened and returned to her duties. Olivia exhaled deeply, finally allowing herself to relax. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, one thought lingered in her mind. If this wasn't the first time, how many others had been quietly pushed aside? And more importantly, why? As the plane taxied toward the runway, Olivia leaned back, willing herself to let go of the tension. But her mind refused to rest. The way Mark had squirmed, the hesitation in Emily's voice, the way the passengers had reacted, it all pointed to something bigger. Emily's words echoed in her head. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Olivia glanced down the aisle. Emily was busy preparing the cabin, but every so often she glanced toward Olivia, her face full of guilt, concern, maybe both. The man who had taken her seat was now slumped against a window in economy, avoiding eye contact. He had known. He just didn't care until he got caught. A sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Well, That was uncomfortable. Olivia turned. A woman in 2B was watching her with an amused expression. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in a crisp beige blazer, carrying herself with quiet authority. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "I take it you were watching?" The woman smirked. "Oh, honey, everyone was watching." She leaned in slightly. "You handled it well. I would have lost my mind." Olivia gave a tight smile. "Trust me, I considered it." The woman extended a manicured hand. "Margaret Bishop." Olivia shook it. "Olivia Hayes." Margaret's eyes flickered with recognition. "Hayes?" Her brow lifted slightly. "The Olivia Hayes, CEO of Hayes Consulting." Olivia offered a modest nod. She was used to this reaction. Margaret let out a low chuckle. "Well, that flight manager really messed with the wrong woman today." Olivia smirked. "Seems that way." Margaret's expression shifted, growing serious. "You do realize that what just happened wasn't an accident, right?" Olivia exhaled. "I had a feeling." Margaret nodded toward Emily, who was still working her way through the aisle. "That young woman back there." She paused, choosing her words carefully. She wanted to say more, but she was afraid. I could see it all over her face. Olivia followed Margaret's gaze, her mind already turning. There was more to this story, and she wasn't about to let it go. Olivia's gaze drifted toward Emily Parker as the flight attendant moved through the cabin, carefully handing out pre-flight drinks. Her posture was precise, her movements practiced, but her shoulders were tense. "Maybe I should talk to her," Olivia mused. Margaret Bishop, seated beside her in 2B, nodded approvingly. "Smart move," she murmured. "But be careful. If this is as systemic as it seems, they might be watching." Olivia's eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin. Mark Sullivan was speaking quietly to another flight attendant, his expression tight, his gestures controlled. He was rattled. "Good." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelts." Olivia clicked hers into place, but her mind was already planning her next move. The plane had reached cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and warm towels. Emily hesitated slightly as she reached Olivia's row. "Would you like anything to drink, Miss Hayes?" Olivia looked up, meeting her gaze. "Just water. And if you have a moment, I'd love to chat." Emily stiffened slightly but nodded. "I'll be right back." Margaret shot Olivia a knowing look. A minute later, Emily returned, carefully setting the water down. Then she knelt slightly beside Olivia's seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have long," she murmured, "but you should know, this happens more often than people realize." Olivia's fingers tightened around the glass. "How often?" Emily swallowed. "Enough that I started keeping track." Olivia's eyes sharpened. "Keeping track how?" Emily hesitated, then pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket. She flipped through several pages before stopping on a list of names. "This is just for my flights over the past 6 months," she whispered. Olivia skimmed the list. Every single name belonged to a person of color. Every single one had been reassigned, downgraded, or mysteriously bumped off flights. A slow fire lit in Olivia's chest. "This isn't an accident," she said. Emily shook her head. "No, ma'am, it's not." Olivia's grip tightened on the armrest as she stared at the notebook. Each name carried a story. Passengers who had paid for their seats only to be reassigned or pushed aside. And the common thread? They all looked like her. "How long have you been keeping this?" Olivia asked, her voice low. Emily glanced over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "About 6 months," she admitted. "At first, I thought it was just bad luck. But then it kept happening." Olivia's pulse pounded. The list wasn't just long, it was systematic. "Who's behind this?" she pressed. Emily exhaled slowly. "I don't know exactly, but I have a theory." She paused, then added carefully, "It's always last-minute reassignments or VIP requests, and it's always approved by a senior flight manager." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "Mark?" Emily nodded. "Him, and a few others at different airports. But Mark, he's been involved more than anyone." Olivia wasn't surprised. She had seen the way he tried to talk his way out of it earlier, the way he avoided eye contact when Captain Reynolds stepped in. He knew. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up?" Olivia asked. Emily hesitated. Then, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because the people who do, don't last long." Olivia's stomach tightened. "You mean, they get fired?" Emily nodded. "Or transferred. Silently pushed out, no explanations, no warnings, just gone." A heavy silence settled between them. Olivia had dealt with corporate corruption before, but this was different. This was personal. She closed the notebook and handed it back to Emily. "I need a copy of this." Emily hesitated. "If they find out I gave this to you," Olivia placed a steady, reassuring hand on hers. "They won't. I'll handle it." Emily studied Olivia's face for a long moment. Then finally, she nodded. "I'll send you photos," discreetly. Olivia's phone buzzed in her lap. A text. Unknown number. "We need to talk, see." Olivia's eyes flickered toward the cockpit. "Captain Reynolds." She nodded at Emily. "We'll talk later." Emily quickly stood and returned to her duties, blending seamlessly back into the cabin crew. Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Now she just needed to figure out what to do with them. Olivia made her way toward the front of the cabin. Mark shot her a wary glance as she passed, but he said nothing. Emily had already unlocked the cockpit door. Inside, Captain Reynolds was waiting. "Close the door behind you," he said. Olivia did as instructed, folding her arms. "You texted me?" Reynolds nodded, his expression unreadable. "I saw the way you handled yourself back there," he said, "and I saw the way Mark reacted." He studied her carefully. "You're not just any passenger, are you?" Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Does it matter?" A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No, what matters is that you're asking the right questions." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wasn't sure if I should get involved," he admitted, "but after what I just saw, I think you're the only person who can do something about this." Olivia unfolded the paper. Her blood ran cold. It was an internal memo from the airline's corporate office. A directive. Priority seating adjustments. Effective immediately. Ensure that VIP and priority passengers receive optimal seating. In cases of limited availability, select reassignment options at the discretion of senior flight management. Ensure these adjustments do not create public incidents or complaints. Discretion is key. Olivia stared at the words, her hands tightening into fists. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't a mistake. This was policy. She looked up, her voice cold as steel. "This is a quiet directive for bumping people like me." Reynolds nodded grimly. "And they count on passengers not fighting back." Olivia folded the memo carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "They messed with the wrong woman," she said. "Do not create public incidents or complaints. Discretion is key." Olivia's hands tightened around the memo. She looked up, her voice cold as steel. "This is a quiet policy for bumping people like me." Captain Reynolds nodded grimly. "And they count on passengers not fighting back." Olivia folded the paper carefully, slipping it into her pocket. She could feel it there, like a burning ember against her skin. It was proof, solid, undeniable proof that the airline had a calculated system to push certain passengers aside. Now she had to decide what to do with it. Captain Reynolds watched her carefully. "I assume you want to take this public?" Olivia exhaled, steadying herself. "That depends," she said. "How deep does this go?" Reynolds leaned against the cockpit door, his expression grim. "I've been flying for nearly 30 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of things that didn't sit right, but this," he shook his head. "This is something else." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "You've seen this happen before?" Reynolds hesitated. Then he nodded. "More times than I can count. Sometimes it's subtle. A clerical error here, a last-minute VIP request there, but when you start noticing a pattern, it stops looking like a mistake." Olivia gritted her teeth. "And you've never reported it?" Reynolds gave her a long, steady look. "To who?" he asked. "The same corporate heads that approve this policy?" Olivia hated that he had a point. She had spent years navigating the corporate world. She knew how these things worked. The people in charge didn't just ignore problems. They buried them, which meant she needed a new strategy. She took a breath. "If I go public," she said, "they'll deny it. They'll call it a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. Maybe they'll fire a few people to make it look like they're fixing the problem." She shook her head. "That won't be enough." Reynolds crossed his arms. "Then what do you suggest?" Olivia's mind was already racing ahead. She needed leverage, something they couldn't dismiss. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Emily. "How many flight attendants have seen this happen?" The response came almost instantly. "A lot. Some are afraid to talk, but I can find a few who will." That was a start. Olivia looked back at Reynolds. If I can get testimonies from crew members, past passengers, and back it up with this memo, we can expose them in a way they can't ignore. Reynolds nodded. You're thinking class action lawsuit. Exactly, Olivia said. They won't just have to deal with bad press, they'll have to deal with real consequences. Reynolds exhaled. That's a hell of a fight to pick. Olivia's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. I like a good fight. Mark Sullivan was pacing near the galley, his fingers tapping impatiently against his folded arms. He had been trying to ignore the growing tension in first class. But something was wrong. Emily had been whispering to passengers. Olivia had been pulled into the cockpit with Captain Reynolds. Mark wasn't stupid. He knew when something was slipping out of his control. He flagged down a flight attendant. Where's Emily? The woman hesitated. She's still working the cabin. Mark frowned. Tell her I need to speak with her, privately. The attendant nodded and walked away. Mark took a slow breath. For years, he'd been the one keeping things quiet, making sure certain passengers didn't cause trouble. It was always easy. A small reassignment here, a refund offer there. Most people backed down, but Olivia Hayes wasn't following the script. And that was a problem. Emily returned to Olivia's seat, slightly out of breath. Mark is looking for me, she murmured. Olivia's eyes darkened. He knows, Emily nodded. I don't know what he'll do, she said, but I don't think he'll let this go easily. Olivia tapped her fingers against the armrest, thinking fast. If Mark was starting to panic, that meant she was close to something big. She leaned forward. Emily, do you trust me? Emily hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes. Good, Olivia said, because we're about to make sure they never get away with this again. Emily's breath was uneven. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. If Mark figures out I've been talking to you. Olivia cut her off with a steady look. Then we stay ahead of him. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. But the tension in her eyes didn't fade. Olivia leaned in. Listen to me, she said. People like Mark count on silence. They assume no one will push back. That's how they get away with this. She placed a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. But you've already taken the hardest step. You spoke up. Now, Olivia continued, we make sure your voice is heard. Emily inhaled sharply. She steadied herself, then nodded. What do you need me to do? Olivia glanced around the cabin. The passengers had settled in. Some were engrossed in their in-flight entertainment. Others were mindlessly scrolling through their phones. They had witnessed the injustice. But would they care enough to take action? That was Olivia's next step. Can you get me a list of the flight crew who have seen this happen before? She asked. Emily hesitated. I can try, she said, but some are too scared to get involved. Find the ones who aren't, Olivia said. Even 2 or 3 voices will make a difference. Emily exhaled. Okay, she said, I'll see what I can do. Olivia nodded. And while you do that, I'm going to talk to some passengers. Mark Sullivan stood near the galley, arms folded, his foot tapping impatiently. The flight attendant he had sent to fetch Emily returned, alone. She's still serving passengers, the woman explained. She said she'd come when she's free. Mark's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being ignored. His eyes flickered toward first class, where Olivia Hayes sat, cool and composed, like she hadn't just unraveled an entire operation. She's dangerous. Mark had handled situations like this before. Passengers who made a scene, passengers who asked too many questions. It was always easy to de-escalate. A free flight credit here, an apology wrapped in corporate speak there. Most people backed down. But Olivia Hayes wasn't backing down. Worse, she had Captain Reynolds on her side. Mark took a slow breath. He had to act before things got out of control. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his superior on the ground. We have a problem. Olivia Hayes is causing a disruption. Define disruption. She's questioning the seat reassignment. She's getting the crew involved. Handle it quietly. Mark's fingers hovered over the screen before adding. What if she doesn't back down? A long pause. Then make sure she does. Mark locked his phone and exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what that meant. Olivia scanned the rows of passengers. Margaret Bishop, the woman in 2B, was still watching her with quiet curiosity. Olivia leaned over. Mrs. Bishop, do you have a moment? Margaret smirked. After the show you put on earlier, I've got plenty of time. Olivia smiled but kept her voice low. I need to ask you something. Margaret set down her glass of wine. Go on. What you saw happened to me, Olivia said carefully. It's not the first time. Margaret's sharp eyes studied her. And it won't be the last, Olivia continued, unless we do something about it. Margaret leaned in slightly. You're not just looking for sympathy, are you? Olivia shook her head. I need people willing to speak up. Names attached to statements. Margaret exhaled, considering. What exactly are you planning? Olivia kept her voice firm. A lawsuit, one big enough that the airline can't ignore it. Margaret leaned back, clearly impressed. You're bold. I'll give you that. Olivia smirked. I've been called worse. Margaret chuckled, then grew serious. I'll help, she said. And I know a few others who might too. Relief flooded Olivia. This was exactly what she needed, people willing to take a stand. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mark approaching. Emily had been right. He wasn't going to let this go. Olivia didn't move as Mark stopped beside her seat. Instead, she sat back, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had played this game before, the quiet power struggle of corporate politics. The key was to stay calm, let the other person show their hand first. Mark's fake professional smile was firmly in place. Miss Hayes, may I have a word in private? Olivia tilted her head slightly. Anything you have to say, she said smoothly, you can say right here. Mark's smile didn't waver, but his eyes flickered to Margaret in 2B, who was watching with open amusement. Other passengers were paying attention too. He had no choice but to keep his voice low. I'd like to resolve this situation amicably, he said. Olivia arched an eyebrow. And what situation is that? Mark inhaled slowly, as if reining in his frustration. The misunderstanding regarding your seat, he said. I'd like to formally apologize on behalf of the airline. Olivia waited. She could tell there was more. Mark cleared his throat. To make up for the inconvenience, we'd like to offer you a full refund for your ticket and a complimentary first-class voucher for your next flight. Margaret let out a soft chuckle. Now that's interesting. Olivia's lips curved, but there was no humor in them. So let me get this straight, she said. You're offering me compensation to forget that this happened? Mark hesitated. No, he said carefully. I'm offering compensation because we value our passengers. Olivia leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Mark, she said. Would I have gotten this offer if I hadn't fought back? Mark's jaw tightened. That's what I thought, Olivia said, sitting back. You're not sorry this happened. You're sorry you got caught. A flicker of irritation crossed Mark's face, but he quickly masked it. He wasn't used to losing control of the conversation. We'd appreciate your cooperation, Miss Hayes, he said, his tone sharper now. Olivia met his gaze head-on. And I'd appreciate transparency, she countered. Why does your airline have an internal memo instructing flight managers to discreetly reassign certain passengers? Mark's entire body went rigid. For the first time, Olivia saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear. His voice dropped lower. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Margaret let out a laugh. Oh, honey, wrong thing to say. Olivia's smile didn't reach her eyes. I know exactly what I'm getting into. Mark straightened. I'll be back shortly. Olivia watched him walk away. His pace was a little too stiff, his shoulders a little too tense. He was rattled. Good. Margaret took a sip of her wine. Well, that was fun. Olivia smirked. He'll be back. And next time, she added, he won't be offering me free flights. Margaret nodded. They're going to try to shut you down. Olivia exhaled, glancing at her phone. A new message from Emily. Emily, I got 3 crew members who will talk, but they're scared. Olivia's fingers tightened around the phone. Not for long. Emily's message came through almost immediately. Emily, they're scared. Olivia's fingers flew across the screen. Olivia, tell them they're not alone. She had witnesses. She had evidence. And now, she had leverage. Mark Sullivan stepped into the small crew office near the galley and locked the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and dialed. A voice answered immediately. Well? Mark exhaled sharply. We have a problem. She knows about the memo. A beat of silence. Then, handle it. Mark's jaw tightened. She's not backing down. Another pause. Then the voice came back, cold and final. Then make her. Mark hesitated. And if she won't? The voice didn't hesitate. Make sure she doesn't have a choice. Mark locked his phone and took a slow breath. He knew exactly what that meant. Olivia stared out the cabin window, the endless stretch of clouds below doing little to calm the storm inside her. The exchange with Mark had confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about her seat. It was bigger. And now, the airline knew she was onto them. Her phone vibrated in her lap. A message from Emily. Mark just made a call. He looked angry. Olivia's fingers hovered over the screen. Did you hear anything? A long pause. Then, no. But I have a bad feeling. So did Olivia. She glanced up, just in time to see Mark stepping back into first class. His expression was unreadable, but his walk was different now. Purposeful, controlled. He had made a decision. Olivia braced herself as he stopped beside her seat. Miss Hayes, his voice carefully even. I need you to come with me. Margaret Bishop set down her wineglass with a smirk. She's comfortable where she is, thank you. Mark's jaw clenched, but he kept his focus on Olivia. It's a private matter, he said. Olivia met his gaze. If it's about my seat, that's already been settled. Mark took a slow breath. It's about the memo. The air around them seemed to tighten. Olivia exchanged a glance with Margaret, then slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Margaret touched her arm lightly. You sure about this? Olivia nodded. I want to hear what he has to say. Mark stepped aside, gesturing toward the galley. Olivia followed, her heart steady but her mind racing. She knew what this was. A final attempt to control the situation. As soon as they were out of the passenger's earshot, Mark turned to face her. His professional mask had cracked. There was no friendliness left. You need to drop this, he said flatly. Olivia crossed her arms. Drop what exactly? Mark's eyes darkened. Don't play dumb, he said. You're digging into something you don't understand. Olivia arched an eyebrow. Enlighten me. For a brief second, she thought she saw something that almost looked like regret. But then, it was gone. You think exposing this will change anything? Mark's voice lowered, almost a whisper. You think one lawsuit will fix a system built to protect people like me and push people like you aside? Olivia inhaled sharply. The raw admission hit harder than she expected. He wasn't denying it, he was confirming it. Mark took a step closer. Let me be clear, he said. If you walk off this plane and make this public, you won't just be going up against this airline. His voice dropped even lower. You'll be going up against the industry. Olivia didn't flinch. Then I guess the industry picked the wrong woman to silence. Mark's lip curled slightly. I admire your confidence. Olivia tilted her head. That sounds a lot like fear. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He exhaled sharply and stepped back. This is your last warning, Miss Hayes. Olivia took a slow, deliberate step forward. No, Mark, this is yours. She turned and walked back to her seat. She didn't look back, and Mark didn't follow. Margaret raised an eyebrow as Olivia sat down. Well, Olivia exhaled. They're scared. Margaret smirked. Good. Olivia picked up her phone and sent one final message to Emily. Olivia, it's time to go all in. She sat back in her seat, her mind racing through every word Mark had just said. If you walk off this plane and make this public, you won't just be going up against this airline, you'll be going up against the industry. Good. She had spent her career fighting for fairness, for accountability. This wasn't just about her seat anymore. It was about every passenger who had been quietly pushed aside. Every person who had been told to accept unfair treatment because that was just how things worked. Well, not this time. Her phone vibrated. A message from Emily. Emily, meet me near the rear galley in 5 minutes. It's important. Olivia glanced toward the front of the cabin. Mark was still standing near the galley, but his posture was different now. Rigid, on edge. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was waiting for something, or maybe dreading something. Olivia unbuckled her seatbelt. Margaret gave her a knowing look. More secrets to uncover? Olivia smirked. Always. She made her way toward the back of the plane. Flight attendants moved around her, but she caught a few glancing at her, exchanging quick looks. The crew knew something. Emily was waiting by the rear galley, arms crossed, her expression tense. Olivia immediately sensed the shift in her energy. What is it? Olivia asked. Emily exhaled. I just spoke with the 3 crew members who were willing to talk. Olivia nodded. And, Emily hesitated. One of them, her name is Vanessa. She's been with the airline for 7 years. Emily swallowed hard. She told me something I didn't expect. Olivia frowned. What? Emily glanced around. Then, in a quiet whisper, she said, There's a list. Emily glanced around before lowering her voice. I overheard a conversation last month, she said, between Mark and another flight manager. Olivia's pulse quickened. A conversation about what? Emily swallowed. They weren't just talking about bumping passengers, she whispered. They were talking about a list. Olivia's stomach dropped. A list of what? Emily hesitated before meeting Olivia's gaze. High-risk passengers. A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Define high risk. Emily took a deep breath. Passengers who are more likely to cause disruptions. People who might challenge unfair treatment. She hesitated again. Then, people who fit a certain profile. Olivia's jaw clenched. So this wasn't just random discrimination. They were targeting people. Emily nodded grimly. They keep track of passengers who push back. And not just on flights. If you complain too much at the ticket counter, at customer service, anywhere, you get flagged. Olivia's hands curled into fists. And then? Emily exhaled. Then they make sure you have a harder time flying. Last-minute reassignments, accidental downgrades, extra security checks, whatever it takes to make sure you don't feel welcome. Olivia took a slow breath, her mind racing. Now it made sense. She had heard stories before. Frequent travelers, especially people of color, who always seemed to have bad luck with airlines. Late bookings, lost luggage, sudden seating errors. It wasn't bad luck, it was by design. Emily's voice shook slightly. Vanessa told me something else. Olivia braced herself. What? Emily hesitated. You're on the list now. The words settled over Olivia like a weight. She had known she was making herself a target by pushing back. But hearing it confirmed? That meant they were afraid. Good. She met Emily's gaze. Can Vanessa prove any of this? Emily nodded. She has emails, screenshots. She's willing to share them. Olivia's heart pounded. That was it. That was the missing piece. We're going public, Olivia said. Not just about the seat changes. About all of it. Emily nodded firmly. I'll help in any way I can. Olivia placed a hand on her shoulder. You already have. She turned and walked back to her seat. Her mind was set. When this plane landed, she wasn't just going to expose the truth, she was going to burn their entire system to the ground. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Seattle. Please fasten your seatbelts. Olivia stared out the window. The city lights glowed below, growing larger by the second. But her mind was elsewhere. They had a list, a system, a deliberate way to silence and suppress certain passengers. And now, she had proof. The anger simmering beneath her skin wasn't just personal anymore. It was purposeful. She turned to Margaret, who had been watching her in quiet amusement. You have that look, Margaret mused, sipping the last of her wine. The one that says you're about to make someone very, very uncomfortable. Olivia smirked. Oh, I plan on making a lot of people uncomfortable. Margaret chuckled. Good, I love a proper takedown. Olivia leaned in slightly. I'm not just filing a complaint. I'm taking this public. Margaret's expression sharpened. You mean media? Olivia nodded. Media, lawyers, social justice groups, anyone who will listen. And with the evidence I have, they won't be able to ignore it. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek business card. She slid it across the armrest. My son is an investigative journalist, she said casually. He loves stories like this. Olivia picked up the card. Lucas Bishop, senior correspondent, Global News Network. A slow smile spread across her face. I think I'd like to meet your son. Margaret grinned. That's what I thought. Mark Sullivan stood by the galley, staring blankly at the airline-issued tablet in his hands. His fingers hovered over an unsent message to his supervisor. Mark, she's not backing down. She has crew members willing to talk. He hesitated. Then he added, Mark, and she has proof. His stomach churned. This wasn't just a problematic passenger anymore. This was a problem, a major one. The airline had always relied on plausible deniability, random system errors, misunderstandings. But proof? That was dangerous. Mark took a slow breath and erased the message. He wasn't going to be the fall guy for this. If Olivia Hayes wanted a fight, she'd have to take it to the people above him. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling onto the runway. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers stood, stretching and retrieving their belongings. Olivia moved calmly, her every motion precise. She was in control now. Emily passed by, her expression tense. Be careful, she whispered. They're not going to let this go easily. Olivia nodded. Neither will I. She stepped into the jet bridge. Mark was waiting near the exit, arms crossed. His expression was no longer polite. It was a warning. This is bigger than you, he said under his breath. You don't know what you're up against. Olivia tilted her head slightly. Neither do you. Mark exhaled sharply. You can't fight an industry, Miss Hayes. Olivia smiled, slow and confident. Watch me. And with that, she walked away, toward the battle ahead, toward justice, toward the truth that would shake the skies. Olivia Hayes' fight doesn't end when she steps off that plane, and neither does ours. This story isn't just fiction. It's inspired by real injustices that happen every day. How many times have people been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside because those in power thought they could get away with it? Not anymore. Drop your location in the comments and let's make this conversation global. If you want more gripping, eye-opening stories, subscribe now. The truth deserves to be told. And together, we can make sure it is.